Happy Monday, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Sermon Scraps. There's not a lot additional to talk about in this psalm. Well, there's always a lot, but this one should be a little bit shorter than the 10 to 15 that they normally go. At least I think. We'll see when we get to the end. So a big idea about this psalm is this prayer or this psalm could be seen as a way in which we spend time with God. So it begins with us crying out to God. We cry out to Him. Verse 3 talks about we prepare a sacrifice, that is worshiping Him, and then we watch and wait for Him, and then we enter into His house. In verse 7, because of that sacrifice, which we saw in Hebrews 4, is where we are allowed to come into His presence boldly. And then there's this contrast between those who are evil. They will not be able to experience that sweet relationship and fellowship with God. One of the things that verse 2 draws out, though, he says, "Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God." One of the commentators said this introduces a significant theme of the Hebrew Psalter, the recognition that Yahweh is both God and King of the psalmist individually and of Israel corporately. So notice that my King and my God. It's not an abstract ideal that David is pursuing or thinking about. This is my King, my God. It's personal. Another commentator said that this is a good way to measure how well you are praying and whether as you pray you are drawing close to God or are merely mouthing words. If you are drawing close to God, you will become increasingly sensitive to sin, which is inevitable since the God you are approaching is a holy God. Now that's where, as you read through, as we continue going through a lot of these Psalms, you'll see this shift. So like the first three verses talk about David calling out to God, and then shifts again in verses 4 through 6 to looking at sin around him. 7 and 8 is back to God. 9 and 10 is towards the evil people, and David asking to protect him from the evil people, but also to not become like the evil people. So then the kind of big theme in verses 4 through 6 is a separating from God. Another one of the commentators said that in general, the ancient Near Eastern concept of holiness was devoid of any essentially moral element. Holiness was defined by reference to the gods. To be holy was to be what the gods were. Morally, the ancient Near Eastern gods demonstrated no clear distinction from humans. They acted in anger, in lust, or for personal gain. They carried grudges and sought vengeance. They could lie, deceive, and manipulate. Their chief distinction from humans was that they were powerful and lived forever. So essentially, the way that the culture around the Israelites, David viewed the gods was an elevated human. Instead of being completely separate, that we believe God is transcendent, separate from the creation, they believed that they were just basically elevated humans. And so holiness was not defined in basically relation to themselves being God. It was defined in human terms, whereas God comes along, and Israel and the Jewish people come along, and it is defined completely within God's character. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier, I got this from another commentary. It said the prayer is not only for protection from wicked persons, but also a prayer for protection from becoming like them. So that's some of what David is asking God to do here, is not just have protection from them, but to not become like them. You know the proverb, bad company corrupts good morals. That's a little bit of what is going on here. David is asking to be spared from bad company. Verse 7 I thought was interesting as well. It says, because one of the things I talked about, if you think of other world religions, Muslims, for instance, they need to face a specific way. So my wife grew up in Kenya, if you didn't know that, was born in outside Nairobi and grew up most of her life there up until high school. And so she really likes ethnic food. So we went to the Midtown Global Market when her parents were out here in the beginning of June, and we walked by a little prayer stall that was face a specific direction. So Muslims need to pray to Mecca every time that they pray, and if they miss, then it is considered heresy. And so I thought it was interesting that David actually picks up kind of a similar theme here. He says, "I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you." What we need to remember is because Jesus hadn't come yet, because the sacrifice hadn't been made, there was a separation between God and his people. So in the account of Jesus dying, that's the significance of the curtain being torn in two. And so where we could only worship God at a specific place, we can now worship God anywhere and everywhere. And this is what Jesus gets at in John chapter 4 when he meets the woman at the well in Samaria, where he says, "You Samaritans worship on this mountain, mountain. We Jews worship at this mountain, but a time is coming and is now here where those who worship God will worship in spirit and in truth. So worshiping God is no longer a situation or positionally specific. We can worship God anywhere and everywhere. In fact, we're commanded to worship God anywhere and everywhere. I also thought verse 8 was interesting. David prays to make your way straight before me. Now remember, the Psalms have served as a songbook, a hymn book for God's people for centuries. And so I think there's a connection in here as well where Jesus comes along and says that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so when Jesus comes along, he could be picking up on similar themes here, where following Jesus leads us towards righteousness and away from those evildoers, those who are living in sin. And so there's all these repeated themes and ideas that we can trace throughout the storyline of the Bible. Verse 9, I thought the very beginning says, "For there is no truth in their mouth." Again, that theme is picked up in Romans chapter 3, where Paul is going on about those who are that no one is righteous. But we also need to remember, because these people are talking about no truth, we need to be reminded of the reality that if something is true, then it is some way to point us to God. Because one of the things I was taught at college was all truth is God's truth. So when we look at modern philosophy, sociological tools, thinking, ways of operating, it shouldn't scare us, because eventually the truth is going to win out. And just like it shouldn't scare us, we should be looking for ways and glimpses of that which is really true in all these arguments that people are making. Because there's something inherently good and true about people. And so we need to care for people and then look for ways that their ideas can potentially serve as a way for us to point them, to share with them the gospel message. But because there is generally a nugget of truth in most things people say, those are the things that we need to be looking for. Verse 10 also says, "Make them bear their guilt, O God." And so often we view God as this like vindictive manipulator who's just out to try to hurt people. But this says it is their own guilt that they are going to bear on themselves. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Great Divorce, which is a weird look at the afterlife and hell, says in there that there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find, those who knock, it is opened. Now he's got some weird analogies in that book, but that phrase of the two kind of people in the world, I think, is helpful. Those to whom God says those to whom God says "Thy will be done" will be in hell. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," are the ones that will be in heaven. And that's what verses 11 and 12 talk about, is that is how we can come before God and say to him, "Thy will be done." I thought there was an interesting story that I read that a couple of the commentators pointed out, kind of talking about this idea of God's protection being over them. And that is Martin Luther. When he was called to Augsburg, when he was summoned for his heretical opinions, one of the servants that was on the way towards his walk there said, "Where will you find shelter if your patron should desert you?" Luther answered, "Under the shelter of heaven." So even when we are facing incredible difficulties, we can find shelter and comfort under the shelter of heaven. We'll be continuing our Psalm series next week, Psalm chapter 6. So go ahead and read ahead if you would like to do that. And Lord willing, we'll see you on Sunday.